Ready for an extended offensive, Israel renews airstrikes on the Gaza Strip as rocket fire from the Hamas-ruled territory intensifies. With the cycle of violence seemingly endless, are attitudes on both sides hardening? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. The Israeli government is warning of a possible ground offensive in Gaza as it ramps up airstrikes on the coastal strip. Tensions have escalated since the abduction and murder of 3 Israeli settlers and the apparent revenge killing of a Palestinian teenager. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is under pressure to take a tougher stance against rocket fire from Gaza. A spokesman for Hamas says Israel will pay the price for his crimes. We'll be gauging the mood in Gaza in just a moment after we hear from Nesrin El-Shamaili in Jerusalem.
Well, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has instructed the army to prepare for a possible ground offensive. Now, this means that the government is trying to show it is putting all options on the table and wants the army to be ready for any possible change of plans. Now, Netanyahu has ordered a long, continuous and forceful operation in Gaza. This approach is different from the statements we've heard from him recently in recent days, where he has made it clear that he is not interested in a large-scale operation or escalation. But Netanyahu has been coming under a lot of pressure, not only by right-wing cabinet ministers, but also by the Israeli public, especially residents of southern communities close to the Gaza Strip that say they have been coming under heavy rocket fire from Gaza. Now, these people are calling for a wider, more extensive military operation, including a ground offensive. And some of them say that maybe Netanyahu won't even go through with such an operation because they feel all they've been hearing from him are empty promises recently. Now, Netanyahu's popularity may be suffering at this time, especially after his foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, on Monday ended the partnership between his party, Israel Beitenu, and Netanyahu's Likud party on the grounds that he wasn't firmly dealing with the rockets from Gaza, and this only further corners the prime minister.
Well, plenty to discuss then. Let's bring in our panel. In Los Angeles, Ali Abunimah, journalist and co-founder of Electronic Intifada. From Tel Aviv, Dahlia Scheindlin, a columnist at Plus 972 magazine and a lecturer at Tel Aviv University. And joining us from London is Daniel Levy, director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you all for being on Inside Story today. If I may start with you, Ali Abunimah, in Los Angeles, we have seen escalations in the past. There was, of course, 2008, 2009, 2012. Do you feel that the situation now is different from what we've seen in the past?
Well, you know, once again, I mean, it's sadly familiar. Once again, Palestinians in Gaza are being bombed. There are reports today, horrifying reports of a number of civilians, including children, killed. And all of this is unnecessary. What disturbs me is that we have this false narrative being repeated by the Israeli government and by media who fail to question it, that Israel is simply responding and trying to defend itself, when the facts are, and the figures here from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, that up to June 30th of this year, so before even this latest horrifying escalation of violence, up to June 30th, the number of Palestinians killed by Israel is triple the number of the same period last year. Right. So the question is, why has Israel escalated the violence? Why has it tightened the siege on Gaza, which is a form of warfare? And can we expect that people in Gaza and Palestinians generally can face this kind of escalating brutality with the world doing nothing about it?
Let me just ask you this, Ali. The question being raised by some in the region right now and by some in the media is that this will spark a third uprising, a third intifada. Do you think this is the case? Is this a precursor, or is this going to die down in the coming days and the coming weeks, do you think?
Well, even if it dies down in the coming days, the situation is not going away. It's only going to escalate because you have more than 5 million Palestinians being denied their most fundamental rights by an Israel that is becoming more extreme, more racist, more bold in settling and colonizing land, that is subjecting people in Gaza to cruel and inhumane conditions of siege where, very little is allowed in or out of Gaza. Exports from Gaza this year have been zero. People aren't able to make a living. They aren't able to survive. And if they raise a peep, they have the warplanes and the drones overhead. I mean, Israel shoots at fishermen and shoots at farmers. Israel has constantly violated the November 2012 ceasefire. So the question that needs to be directed at Israel is this. If Israel wants calm, why doesn't it stop its escalation and abide by the ceasefire it agreed to in November 2012?
All right, let's ask Dahlia in Tel Aviv about the view in Israel right now on this latest operation. Dahlia, how do Israelis feel about this latest operation in Gaza? And is there a sense there that this could escalate into something more serious, another war?
It's a little bit hard to know exactly how Israelis feel right now, seeing as the formal name of the operation, in other words, the acknowledgement that there is an operation in Gaza, only came last night. We don't know exactly, but from past experience, Israelis, when they are dealing with rocket fire, have tended to support these wars in Gaza, and I call them wars purposely, between 80 and 90% among the Jewish population. When you ask if this is different from 2008 or 2012, I have not heard any Israelis saying, we're suffering rocket fire or we're suffering from an untenable explosive situation because of our policies. What they tend to do is reinforce the paradigms and narratives about both sides and say it's only because Palestinians are terrorists that we must always be in this situation. And therefore, when the rockets start flying, I hear Israelis calling for, revenge and to hit them hard. And it's rare to hear any voices saying, maybe we should be changing our policy towards Israel. There has been this attitude in Israel for many years that there is a status quo on security that is sustainable. I hear this from people. I hear this from the security establishment. And the first question in my mind over these last few weeks has been, will this turn into a sort of implosion of the status quo narrative where Israelis realize that it's not tenable in the absence of a political agreement? And I don't see any evidence of that so far. I would have liked to think so. The other main difference, I think, from the past is that Israel has perceived itself as having legitimacy to go to war against Gaza. And again, I use that term quite consciously. In late 2008, early 2009, and in 2012, particularly in 2008-9, because there were ongoing negotiations. I think the change now is that 2 Gaza wars later, a failed peace process for which many actually do blame Israel in the international community, even in the U.S., and the fact that Israel was dead set against the Palestinian leader Abu Mazen when he was just negotiating on his own because they said the Palestinians were divided and not united. Then against them when they got united, and then immediately escalated. I think Israel is losing legitimacy to have these kinds of wars and to perpetrate aggression, even if Israel sees it as a legitimate response, to defend citizens who are being fired on in the south. And we have to remember that the citizens are really caught in the middle of all this.
Let's hear Daniel Levy's take on the situation right now. Daniel, what do you make of the situation, and how do you see it evolving, taking into account the regional context right now, the war in Syria, the expansion of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the situation in Egypt? Is Netanyahu, who's facing, we know, political pressure inside Israel, is he really going to go as hard as he says he is against Hamas, given the current regional context?
Well, Folly, I just slightly debunk this idea of the pressure Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing domestically. To the extent to which that exists, I think it is largely self-generated. Prime Minister Netanyahu talks big when it comes to how terroristic the Palestinians are, the kind of steps Israel needs to take. I think he behaved extremely irresponsibly during the 2 weeks when the 3 Israelis were missing. I think the defense establishment was quite certain that this was a killing rather than a kidnapping, but I think he chose to fan the flames by playing this as a kidnapping. So to the extent to which there's pressure, he's largely cornered himself. The thing here is that, as with the previous rounds of Israeli aggressive attacks on Gaza, rather than the day-to-day siege, which is quite bad enough, as with previous rounds, Israel has no real out. Israel does not see it as a good idea to reoccupy Gaza. Israel knows that if it puts another Palestinian in charge of Gaza off the back of an Israeli tank, that is unlikely to work well. The Egyptians don't particularly want to take responsibility for Gaza. And the difference today, as you suggested, Folly, is, and I think some in the Israeli security establishment are conscious of this, is the alternative to Hamas is not going to be Palestinians who are grateful for the Israeli siege. It is likely to be a more radicalized community that will be appealed to by ISIS-type phenomenon. You know, the irony is that the West, that has continued to refuse to engage with Hamas, is funding groups that are more extreme than Hamas as the good guys, as the moderates in Syria. The other difference right now in the region, which worries me, is that unlike in 2012, where you had active Egyptian mediation with President Morsi, where you had the Americans talking to the Egyptians who were talking to Hamas, the Americans to the Israelis, and where you had some Arab solidarity with Gaza, which I think acted as a constraining factor on Israel. You had the Egyptian PM there, you had the Arab League Secretary General, you had Arab League foreign ministers. This time around, I fear that there will be little solidarity with, forget Hamas, but also little solidarity with Gazans, and that could encourage Israel to go further than it might otherwise go.
Well, let's take just a quick pause and see how we got to this actual situation right now. This latest escalation began with the abduction of 3 young Israeli settlers. They were abducted in the occupied West Bank on June the 12th while returning home from a religious school. The Israeli government blamed Hamas and responded with its most extensive military operation in the West Bank in years. The bodies of the teenage settlers were found after an 18-day search. Now, in an apparent revenge attack, a 16-year-old Palestinian was kidnapped from occupied East Jerusalem on July the 2nd. His charred body was found hours later. Now, his death triggered days of angry protests in East Jerusalem and in northern Israel. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was categoric in his condemnation of the Israeli killings. He said they were murdered in cold blood by human animals. He went on to say that revenge over the blood of a small child is not the devil's work, and neither is revenge for the blood of a young man who was on his way to meet his parents and whom was never seen again. And he added that Hamas is responsible, Hamas will pay. And following the murder of the Palestinian teenager and the arrest of his suspected killers, Netanyahu struck what appeared at first to be a more conciliatory tone. Take a listen.
I wish to send my condolences to the family of the teenager, and I promise you that we will prosecute those who committed this shocking crime to the full extent of the law, who are deserving of every condemnation. There is no place for these kind of murderers in Israeli society. With that, we are different from our neighbors, where murderers are treated as heroes, and squares are named after them.
All right, Ali Abunimah in Los Angeles, what did you make there of the reaction by the Israeli Prime Minister? He sounded conciliatory at first, but when you hear him say, we're different from our neighbors where murderers are treated like heroes, what does that suggest to you?
He continues to use this racist language in which Palestinians are cast as, his term, human animals. The Israeli government, we now know, concealed from the Israeli public the fact that they knew that the 3 teenagers were dead and went on a rampage in the West Bank. And Netanyahu has been the chief inciter. So, you know, for him to offer condolences to the family of this Palestinian boy who was kidnapped and burned alive is like somebody who murders you and then comes and cries at his funeral. I actually want to agree with Daniel Levy on something, which is that, you know, the so-called international community is so cowed and so complicit in Israel's crimes, particularly the United States, but also the European Union, that we really now have no alternative but to escalate as much as we can popular accountability in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Unless Israel fears consequences for its escalations, unless people like Netanyahu, like Moshe Ya'alon, the so-called defense minister, like Tzipi Livni and Ehud Olmert, the authors of previous massacres in Gaza, unless they fear arrest when they travel abroad, these kinds of massacres will continue.
Okay.
There has to be accountability.
Accountability. Let me, on that point, Dahlia, in Tel Aviv, 6 suspects were arrested in the killing of the Palestinian teenager Mohammed Abu Qadir. The Israeli authorities have called them Jewish extremists, followed by the immediate insistence that they were terrorists. Why this insistence on distinguishing Jewish extremists from the rest of Israelis when they don't do so when it comes to Palestinians, when a Palestinian kills a Jew, for instance?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is very clear. You know, the really sad thing about the escalation over the last, few weeks has been that Israelis have used this to entrench their very stalwart narratives about the Palestinians. I can't speak for the other side, but certainly what Israelis want to think is that we are not extremists, and anybody who would perpetrate this kind of a murder is an extremist. Of course, the designation of terrorist is important for legal reasons. It means that Israel can employ different legal means, extraordinary legal measures against terrorist suspects, and that's why some in the Israeli society have determined to call them terrorists. But I think the problem is also deeper. The problem is that when Israelis call them extremists and all sorts of things, we've heard Israelis of various stripes calling them, monsters, even animals. I think the problem is that that allows us to say they're not really part of the Israeli community, they're not really part of the Jewish community, and in a sense it entrenches the reality that Israel is perpetrating violence against Palestinians all the time in the form of the occupation. And we train ourselves through the national narratives, through the military system, through the nightly news, of course, and the interpretation of every event reinforces the reasons Israel is giving itself for why it continues its military rule over the Palestinians. That is a form of ongoing violence. And when Israel talks about incitement against Palestinians, I think it's worth pointing out that Israelis don't notice this self-reinforcement of this and the self-justification for this ongoing violence against Palestinians, which has claimed many more lives. Tragically, I think there shouldn't be a body count, but there are civilian deaths that far outnumber Israeli civilian deaths due to the conflict on the Palestinian side. But Israel doesn't see it like that. It is almost incapable of seeing like that.
Daniel, do you agree with that?
Calling
do you agree with the point that
Jewish extremists
that Dahlia
as opposed
makes?
to
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to bring in Daniel Levy in London. Do you agree with that point? And also the accusations that the Israeli government already knew about the teenage settlers' death even before their bodies were found, and that basically they used this to whip up the frenzy and round up hundreds of people in the West Bank. Do you think this was a smokescreen for the Israeli government?
I think what happened, Folly, was probably something like this. The working hypothesis of the intel and security establishment, I'm pretty sure, was that the 3 boys were murdered at the moment of abduction or shortly thereafter. Netanyahu, I imagine, turned around and said, show me the bodies. They couldn't deliver the bodies, so he said, I'm going to treat the working assumption as a kidnapping, knowing that of course, the loss is tragic on any side, all the same, but knowing that you whip up the Israeli public in a certain way and you demonize the Palestinians in a certain way if you work on the kidnapping assumption, it also, of course, allowed him to do 2 other things, which was to carry out a mass act of collective punishment and an attempt to degrade Hamas, and not just Hamas, on the West Bank, and to attack Abbas diplomatically for making a unity agreement with Hamas. So this served him in several ways, and of course it exacerbated and increased tensions.
Where does this leave Abbas? I mean, Hamas is not part of the unity government.
Well, this
How much
leaves
pressure
Abbas,
is this putting on Abbas and the unity government?
Yeah, it leaves Abbas where Netanyahu wants him, which is weakened whichever way he goes. If he disowns Hamas, then he is weakened because, as Israel well knows and therefore encourages, Palestinian division is good for an Israel that wants to control the Palestinians. If he sticks with the deal, then it's easier for Netanyahu to attack him in public opinion. But the important point is that I think Abbas fell into a trap, perhaps, by saying to the Israelis after the apparent abduction and when proof became clear of the killing of Mohammed Abu Qadir, he said, I want you now to make sure that the perpetrators are arrested and to condemn this. It's the easiest thing, if you'll excuse me, for Netanyahu to condemn and to arrest. Because what Netanyahu can do against the Palestinians, he will never do against the Israeli Jewish collective, which is collective punishment, home demolitions, land confiscation. Yeah, what are you going to do? Build a Palestinian settlement or a Palestinian community somewhere in Israel as a punishment? So Abbas fed the idea that there's some kind of symmetry here, rather than the reality of the deep asymmetry of an occupied people and an occupying power, which I don't think helps anyone's clarity of understanding.
Ali Abunimah, where do you think this leaves President Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian president? Should he pursue with the unity government regardless, do you think?
Abbas is effectively the local enforcer for the Israeli occupation. That's increasingly how he's seen by Palestinians. I mean, many Palestinians will look at what's happening in Gaza and see once more the bodies of men, women and children being pulled from the rubble of houses, having been killed by the Israeli army, and say to Abbas, how could you continue your security coordination with the Israeli army in the West Bank? I mean,
but why haven't we seen protests? Sorry to interrupt you, Ali. Why haven't we seen protests in the West Bank, Ali, as has been the case when the other intifadas, the previous intifadas started? Why haven't there been violent protests? It seems that it's much more quieter now in the West Bank.
No, I'm sorry. Palestinians are not the ones who generally choose violence. Palestinians are, as Daniel Levy said, an occupied people faced with one of the most heavily armed armies in the world. But in fact, there have been protests throughout the occupied West Bank, including eastern occupied Jerusalem, and there have been protests against the Palestinian Authority, which the U.S. and European financed and trained and Israeli-supported Palestinian Authority security forces have crushed. The fact is, the Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas and the Israeli government are in practice on one side, and the occupied Palestinian people are on another. That is untenable in the long run, because what it is an apartheid regime with a local enforcer like Abantistan. It's not going to rescue Israel in the long run.
Okay, Dahlia, I'll give you the last word. Even as the Israeli army launched its operation on Gaza, we heard the U.S. President Barack Obama urge Israelis and Palestinians to seek a peaceful two-state solution in an article in an Israeli newspaper today. Do you think that the peace process even matters anymore today?
There is a lot of cynicism about the peace process in Israel today, and certainly among the Palestinians. We can point to many surveys showing that the majority of the population on both sides still supports a two-state solution, but there are also surveys showing deep shifts in terms of the lack of belief that that will ever happen, or the desirability of it. On the Palestinian side, a recent survey showed a majority against that, and on the Israeli side, a survey that was conducted for the same conference for which Barack Obama wrote his article showed that when you describe exactly what's in a classic two-state deal of the kind that was negotiated in the year 2000, most Israelis reject that too. And so I think that Israelis are finally, certainly on the Israeli side, I can say they are finally merging their cynicism about the process, which they have always had for the last number of years, with the reality on the ground, even though they have claimed to support such a process. Politically, it's very hard to see how Israel gets back to this. It's very hard to look at the process that Netanyahu led over the previous negotiation and see him negotiating in good faith. There was every reason that this could have gone ahead. Netanyahu, again, had essentially public opinion on his side if he had reached that two-state deal up through the negotiation process. There were certainly political options, alternate coalition models that he could have forged to support it, and it still didn't get there. It's hard to see how we get back to the classic two-state formula that we were debating 14 years ago.
Okay, thank you so much. We're going to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. There's plenty more, obviously, to talk about, but for today, we'll leave it there. Ali Abunimah in Los Angeles, Dahlia Scheindlin in Tel Aviv, and Daniel Levy in London. Thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Story. And do please let us know your thoughts. You can leave your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can go to AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Folly Thibault. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.